When most Yu-Gi-Oh! Duelists think of the dinosaur type from a competitive standpoint, they think of cards like Soul-Eating Oviraptor, Baby Zerasaurus, and Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. If you go a little further back in time, you might bring up the vanilla monsters that define the Great Dino Rabbit deck, but most probably wouldn't remember or even know that a very long time ago, Hydrogeddon was a heavily played card in the competitive meta game. Welcome to another edition of This Was Actually Meta. Today we'll be discussing the short but impactful legacy of maybe Yu-Gi-Oh's first true dominant dinosaur, Hydrogeddon. It may have started as a gimmicky anime card for Bastion's weird water science deck, but he soon became a highly respected competitive contributor. Hydrogeddon was initially released in just the third GX Core booster set, Elemental Energy. As a lowly common, it was almost the epitome of a forgotten card when it first came out. In fact, Hydrogeddon's entire existence spawned from an incredibly gimmicky strategy and theme from Yu-Gi-Oh! GX's own Bastion Misawa. As part of his bond/chemical water deck strategy, Hydrogeddon's intended purpose was to be used in conjunction with its periodic counterpart, Oxygen. The core concept of this strategy was combining 2 Hydrogeddon with 1 Oxygen to summon Bastion's Water Dragon boss monster using bonding H2O. As you might expect, using 4 cards to summon a boss monster that offered no protection, removal, and only had a significant advantage over Pyro monsters was an immediate flop and never saw any significant competitive success. As a theme, the chemical water deck failed miserably, but one of the cards actually had promise. That of course was Hydrogeddon, which had the ability to summon another copy of itself during the damage step if it successfully destroyed an opponent's monster in battle and sent it to the graveyard. That effect had obvious great potential, but the question surrounding Hydrogeddon usually revolved around whether or not its 1600 attack would be adequate enough. As the Yu-Gi-Oh! Community would soon discover, the answer would be a resounding yes. Just like many of the GX era's best hidden gems, Hydrogeddon would take some time to be discovered. In its particular case, the card really didn't make its triumphant competitive debut until nearly a full year after Elemental Energy was released. First, understand, the middle part of GX was largely based around outgrinding your opponent, usually using small, statistically weak monsters with powerful utility effects. The general concept was taking small +1 trades until you eventually out-advantaged your opponents and they wouldn't have enough cards and resources left to defend their life points. Recruiters like Mystic Tomato and Apprentice Magician were incredibly popular, as well as flip effect monsters like Magician of Faith and Dekochi, the Battle Enchanted Locomotive. During these times, when going first, your best plan of action was probably to set up a strong flip monster, something like Dekochi or Magician of Faith, that could net a +1 if it lived, or simply replace itself if it was ran over in battle. This thesis largely crafted how decks were built at the time. However, at Shonen Jump Indianapolis of August 2006, one Joe Haleko entered the tournament with an incredibly aggressive control deck, looking to capitalize on the cookie cutter safe and defensive playstyle that largely defined the metagame. He came equipped with 3 Hydrogeddon in the main deck, and as duelists who faced him in the tournament would soon learn, it was an excellent counter to the norm. Much like Cyber Dragon, but with far greater upside, Hydrogeddon was an absolute destroyer of so many of the flip and recruiter-based monsters that were prominent in the meta. The recruiters were so strong in these years because if you ran over a Mystic Tomato, for example, your opponent was more than likely going to get a Sangan from their deck, which also floated. If you attacked over Apprentice Magician, they'd set Magician of Faith or Old Vindictive Magician. The latter would be flipped during their turn, kill your monster, and it would leave them with numerical and field advantage. Lastly, as stated earlier, most of the commonly played flip monsters would simply replace themselves with other cards. However, Hydrogeddon threw a monkey wrench into all of this and everything that we knew about the meta. For example, if you started the duel by attacking over a set Mystic Tomato, your Hydrogeddon would summon another copy of itself. That second copy could attack over the Sangan, and sure, your opponent would get a replacement monster with the Sangan search, but you'd also in turn get a third copy copy of Hydrogeddon from your deck onto the field that could also attack. Let's stop and evaluate the game state at this point. You'd be +2 with 3 decently sized monsters on the field, whereas your opponent would be even in card advantage, but more than likely have no monster presence on field. The same scenario would play out if your Hydrogeddon attacked over flip monsters like Dekochi or Magician of Faith, -1 Hydrogeddon. Even if you attacked over an Apprentice Magician and your opponent set Old Vindicta from their deck, which could kill the second copy that you would attack into, you'd still end the exchange with a +1 and more monster presence on field than your opponent. Another issue duels would soon come face to face with would be how to effectively use defensive traps against Hydrogeddon. Torrential Tribute was easily one of the strongest trap cards in the game at the time, but wasn't actually as ideal with dealing with Hydrogeddon as you might imagine. In the common earlier scenarios where Hydrogeddon would attack over recruiters and flip monsters, duelists would have to ask themselves if it was worth it taking a -1 and losing both their monster and the trap card to stop multiple Hydrogeddon from hitting the field. After all, Hydrogeddon and recruiter monsters did summon during the damage step where Torrential Tribute could not be used. Joe Haleko must have theory crafted this and other interactions that would come up in duels against the meta. I say this because within his aggressive control strategy, he main deck copies of Royal Decree to lock out standard defensive powerhouses like Mirror Force, Bottomless Trap Hole, and Torrential Tribute. With this, he could rest assured that his offensive pressure wouldn't be stopped so easily. Essentially, all his summons would be hitting the field, and all of his attacks would be hitting monsters and not defensive trap cards. Joe even opted to incorporate more ways to ensure he could effectively run over monsters and trigger Hydrogeddon. We knew the card was inherently great at handling most of the little monsters in the metagame, but he also came prepared for situations when dealing with bigger ones. 2 copies of Enemy Controller as well as an unpredictable pair of Rush Recklessly in the main deck. These cards would allow Hydrogeddon to get over even the likes of Zabord, the Thunder Monarch, or Cyber Dragon, which were the 2 most popular high-level monsters in the game at this time. This excellent deck building not only took Joe as far as a top 4 finish at Shonen Jump Indianapolis, but also started a format-long revolution. And just to be clear, make no mistake, Joe Haleko was the only duelist in the entire Indianapolis top 8 who used Hydrogeddon at all. No other duelist in the top cut even side decked the card. After Joe Haleko's breakout performance at Shonen Jump Indianapolis, Hydrogeddon didn't immediately catch on as you may have imagined. It wouldn't show up again in a Shonen Jump Top 8 deck for 3 more events at Shonen Jump Austin, Texas, where once again a duelist piloting a build with 3 copies in the main deck would find himself making it all the way to the semifinals. Following that, Hydrogeddon saw even more success at the next Shonen Jump held in Seattle, Washington, where 2 duelists in the top 8 both played the card. Sadly, those 2 duelists were ultimately paired up against each other in the quarterfinals. After this, despite Hydrogeddon's incredible effectiveness and proven track record of success, the card didn't really see massive amounts of play in the metagame. There were entire regionals and Shonen Jump championships where it was completely absent from the top cut, which is still pretty baffling to this day. To be honest, I'm not really sure what changed, but after the March 2007 ban list, Hydrogeddon's popularity absolutely exploded. Maybe it was high caliber duelists like Jeff Jones and Andrew Fridella who both made top 8 main decking 3 copies of Hydrogeddon at Shonen Jump St. Louis in February, but one thing's for sure, during the March 2007 format, Hydrogeddon was basically everywhere and in everything. Pure Monarchs, gadgets, aggro beatdowns, perfect circle Monarchs, this guy was showing up all over the place. Even with the legendary Apprentice Monarch deck dead and being phased out, which of course Hydrogeddon absolutely terrorized, the format was still full of very small monsters to punish. Furthermore, I think a lot of people realized that the amount of momentum that could be gained with a successful Hydrogeddon attack was basically unmatched in the game, even by Spirit Reaper. As players embraced Hydrogeddon's power and utility, the card saw success on every level of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Regionals, Shonen Jump championships, and even the 2007 Yu-Gi-Oh! World Championship. Championship, where the second place Machine deck and the first place Monarch build both used the card at 3 copies. Unfortunately, like with all good runs, Hydrogeddons eventually came to an end. One issue the card had is that duelists started to adapt to it. Instead of the low defense Tekochi and Magicians of Face that Hydrogeddon had become famous for rampaging, duelists swapped to incredibly strong, stout defensive monsters like Gravekeeper Spy and Legendary Jiu-Jitsu Master, both of which would actually benefit and result in pluses if the opposing player recklessly attacked into it while face down. In one case, an additional copy of Gravekeeper Spy would be summoned from the deck for free, and in another, Hydrogeddon itself would be sent to the top of its owner's deck, locking it out of its next draw. Neither, of course, was an ideal situation. This switch alone hurt Hydrogeddon's popularity tremendously among the masses, but the real final nail in the coffin was the playstyle shift for the September 2007 format. At the beginning of this format, the 3 top decks of the metagame were Perfect Circle Monarch, CO Burn, and Zombies, and unfortunately for Hydrogeddon, this Monarch build in particular had evolved past setting weak defensive monsters turn 1. Usually Stratos was its normal summon, and that of course was far too large for Hydrogeddon to attack over. The only deck that even looked to play defensive in its first turn was the Cosmic Odyssey Burn deck, but that also featured Skill Drain, Gravity Bind, and Level Limit Area B. There were so many roadblocks that it was almost impossible for Hydrogeddon to land a successful attack, even if the opposing player did set a defensive monster turn 1. In the end, as players loaded up on stronger defensive monsters and played decks and strategies that limited Hydrogeddon's ability to activate its effect, the card simply fell out of favor as the metagame continued to evolve, thus bringing us to the end of our story. If you enjoyed this video or you want to see more in the future like it, give the video a thumbs up. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already.